Salve Greece and Rome students. Welcome back to chapter 10 here. I wanted to look at the next couple emperors with you guys today, and hopefully we should be able to finish up chapter 10 by tomorrow. It's not that big of a chapter. Getting into a quiz probably in the middle of it next week after we do a little bit of practice and review. Okay, so hope you guys have been following along really well, and make sure to pop into my office hours if you have any questions or want to discuss the chapter. Our next test will be on chapters 9 and 10, and I'll give you some review next week. Last time I was with you, we started talking about what's called the 5 good emperors, and we're called that because there's 5 emperors in a row that were in general just didn't go crazy. They tried hard. And the government was run basically fairly well compared to some other emperors, right? 5 in a row, that's pretty good luck. It lasted around 80 years. The first of these was called Nerva, and the situation there was Nerva was only emperor for a few years, but he adopted someone to be a successor out of necessity because he didn't have a son. He adopted the next emperor called Trajan, and then when Nerva died, there was a smoother transition of power. That's another thing, is there was not as much inclination for a civil war or anything because it was already clear that Trajan was chosen as a successor, and so there was not as much of a threat of war. So we'll talk about the reign of Trajan. Excuse me, I'm going the wrong direction here. There we go. All right, so here we have Trajan. He's one of the more famous, well-known, successful emperors. You can see the dates of his reign there, about a 20-year reign, which is pretty successful. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, his full name there, and he was around 44 when he was adopted by Nerva. That'd be pretty bizarre nowadays, adopting a 44-year-old, but again, it was more of a ceremonial thing that could happen in ancient Rome. It doesn't mean he's your little kid now. It means that you're kind of symbolically adopting him and bringing him into the family, and he's going to be your successor. One note about Trajan is that he was born in Spain, so he was the first non-Italian emperor, basically. He was still, of course, Roman, but Rome had basically grown at this time. You could be considered Roman if you were born in Spain or Africa or some of the eastern provinces, etc. So he was from a city called Italica in Spain. Italica, we actually earlier this semester, we saw when Italica was founded during the Second Punic War. So interesting there. He was a very good general. He was already accomplished when he was chosen, right? And he was a rare emperor. A lot of them, maybe they were popular with the military, but the senators hate him, maybe vice versa. But he was in harmony with the army and the Senate. They both appreciated him at the same time, and that led for a pretty successful rule, as we talked about. He was very eager militarily to expand the empire. He was fighting for most of his reign. He was not an emperor who just stayed in Rome. In fact, he was gone from Rome quite a lot, personally leading military campaigns. He turned back the clock a little bit we talked about Domitian wanting to be known as Lord and God and kind of pushing the envelope with dominating the Senate and wanting to flaunt his authority. Trajan took on more of a princeps role of the kind of first citizen, but not rubbing people's faces in his power, not flaunting his power as some sort of absolute dictator. It was also popular when he expanded the alimenta, which we talked about were made under Nerva. They were child support payments that were kind of expanded and clarified under Trajan's rule. Some other things he did was he wanted to change the administration of the provinces to make them more effective and more efficient. So he established these special officers called curators or curatores, and he would send them to provinces, especially ones where maybe things weren't going well. The administration was bad, maybe there was some corruption there, maybe the taxes weren't being appropriately administered, things like that. And then he would send someone he trusted, and hey, your job is to get this province under control and to make it run more efficiently and be less corrupt. A good example of a governor we know about was called Pliny the Younger. I probably mentioned him before, but he was a very famous author in his own right. He wrote a series of letters, the most famous one being his letter about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Pliny the Younger was actually an eyewitness to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So he's an author on one side, but he was also the governor sent to the province of Bithynia Pontus in 111 to rule for Trajan. So he was appointed by Trajan in that role. Interesting that of Pliny the Younger's letters, some of them are to his a friend, to his wife, to various people like that, to family members. It may seem like boring. Why do we read letters? Letters are kind of interesting. Like nowadays we text and stuff, and our letters probably people would not want to read in 2,000 years, but his letters were about things from everyday life. So what his life was like, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, right? Relations with other people, politics of the time. So in college, you can actually take a class all about reading Pliny's letters and learning from their material. Some of his most letters that are studied the most, he actually wrote letters to Trajan when he was emperor of Bithynia Pontus. And so these are some of the only letters we have where a governor writes to the emperor, asks him, hey, what do we do about this situation? And the emperor responds. So in some of his letters, it's a letter to Trajan, and we have the response, which is fascinating. Probably the most famous of those letters is actually a letter that Pliny sent about Christians, because it was still a pretty new sect at this time, and he had all these questions. I don't have the entire letter here to put up for you, but he had all these questions like, what should the punishment be for a Christian? Because it was still not a legal thing at that point. Should we seek out Christians, or should we only punish them if they're brought to us? Things like that. He asked them all these questions, and then Trajan responded, here's what I think you should do. So it's some fascinating evidence about early Christianity that was, from a non-Christian source, a source that would be not biased in any way. And so Pliny's just one of those governors we know about that Trajan sent out to the various provinces. And when you go to Rome, you would always see this column. This is Trajan's column, which all up and down, it's a really large column, you can't tell, but it's several stories high. And it's got carvings of one of his most famous military feats, military accomplishments, carvings all up and down. It's called the Column of Trajan. All right, let me get myself out of there. Some other details about Trajan's rule, and you can see one of Trajan's statues here. He also was a builder, so sometimes while he was gone, he had some things built, grand buildings. He had a large new forum built. He had a marketplace built where there was a new area for shopping and businesses and things like that in the city, and had a number of roads built out throughout the empire. Rome was really big on transportation of goods and soldiers, so their network of roads was second to none. He had a lot of military campaigns, but his most famous one was against the Dacians. Dacia was a region kind of in the far northeast, and nowadays it kind of corresponds almost to modern day Romania. He spent quite some time conquering that. Eventually, he was successful and conquered that area and basically annexed it for Rome, and it became a Roman province for that time. It was a very wealthy area. It brought a ton of wealth to the Roman Empire. They brought back huge amounts of gold, silver, iron, and of course slaves from the defeated soldiers. And so that was actually a huge boon to Rome's treasury. Whenever he won that war, he brought back tons and tons of wealth with him for Rome. He also annexed parts of Arabia and Armenia, who previous to that had just been kind of an allied kingdom. And he brought in multiple provinces into the empire just himself. Towards the end of his reign, he spent that at war in the east with Parthia. How long have the Parthians been a threat to the Romans? We've seen this for a while now, but Trajan's still fighting against them. And he also had to deal with the second Jewish revolt that broke out in 115 AD. We talked about the first Jewish revolt already. Here we're into the second Jewish revolt. So again, Judea and the Jews always being trouble for the Romans to govern for sure. On his way back to Rome, as far as Trajan's death go, he dies unexpectedly on a trip back to Rome. Before he had died, though, he did something very crucial. He had done what his predecessor did, Nerva, and he had adopted someone to send a signal over, this man should be my successor. Trajan did not have a son who he might have chosen his son and said, hey, my son will take over. That's very tempting to do, isn't it, if you're a Roman emperor? But he chooses not to do. He doesn't have a son, and so he adopts someone called Publius Aelius Hadrianus, and we'll call him Hadrian. And so again, the same situation with adopting someone who is already successful, people already respect, and it's just so much better than some teenager who may or may not end up being a good emperor. So you're not rolling the dice as much. So Hadrian will become the next emperor. Another note about Trajan is that because he was so militarily active and such a good general, that under his reign, Rome reached its largest extent. In other words, it controlled more territory than at any other point in Roman history. And if you ever see maps of the Roman Empire, like on my wall in the classroom or online or something, usually they'll show the Roman Empire under Trajan just to show how big it got. So they'll show from this exact time period. So when he died, and notice he is one of the better deaths of an emperor. Some of the emperors are poisoned or assassinated or whatever the case may be, but Trajan was fairly popular, and so he got to die probably of disease or something. But he was in his 60s by that time, so he didn't die as an old man, at least for that time, right? And he didn't get assassinated. So upon his death, his protege Hadrian took over. And here you see Hadrian, even a longer reign than Trajan, also a very popular emperor. Again, by the time he became emperor, he had already kind of been a successful general. He had done things, he had made accomplishments, and so he was able to kind of hit the ground running and not like learning on the job. Hadrian also hailed from Spain, so just after Trajan, they were both from the same area, probably why they knew each other and were friends. When he became emperor, he focused on consolidating the empire. He was active militarily, but he wasn't as focused as Trajan on expanding the empire. So, in fact, the empire during the early part of his reign actually shrunk a little bit, not because Rome was invaded, but because Hadrian tactically pulled back a few places that he thought that, not that Trajan was bad, but he thought that Trajan possibly had extended Rome in some areas that were a little hard to defend because they were on natural borders. And so he strategically pulled back a few areas and made Rome a little bit smaller, but more easily to defend. So that's what the consolidation was. He also traveled extensively through the empire. He was probably one of the most traveled emperors that we know about. We know that he was away from Rome for more than half of his 21-year reign. So constantly traveling, he wanted to view the empire for himself, inspect things, make sure things are going well. And he was just always on the move, or very often on the move. As you can see from his picture, he was the first emperor to wear a full beard. So as we know, people are a little bit wiser when they have beards. So I respect him for that. He was a relatively cultured emperor. He was a good soldier, but also he was into other things. We know that he enjoyed painting. He wrote things. He wrote poetry and other types of literature. And he had a hand in the design of some of his own buildings, right? Rather than just giving them to architects, he liked to get in there and tinker and do things himself. So he was kind of a bit of a Renaissance man as far as having a little bit of everything to do. Luckily for the Romans, Hadrian had no children and no son, especially. And I say luckily because if he had, maybe this reign of good emperors would have been broken at that point. But almost by necessity, he continued the tradition of adopting someone to take over for him. And so, kind of after he reigned for a while, he adopted Titus Aurelius Fulvus Bonianus Aureus Antoninus. Well, I wish we had Curtomen still so I could ask you that question, but we'll just call him Antoninus from now on to make it easier for you guys. But that was his full name. So as Hadrian was getting older, he adopted Antoninus to make it clear he would be his successor. I mentioned how he withdrew from some of Trajan's further conquests. He famously visited Britain in 122 AD, and he was the one who decided that, hey, we need to build a wall across this province. Basically, we've gone far enough north. As we get further north in Britain, it's harder to control that area. It's colder, it's more mountainous, the tribes are harder to take over, and it's just not worth it, basically. We have the better part of Britain. Let's leave the northern, cold, mountainous regions to these barbarians. So he set his men to build a wall that was maybe 85 or 90 miles long, all the way across the island of Britain, and we call that Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall is still a very famous landmark to go to in Britain. I went there a few years ago and walked the length of it. You can see Hadrian's Wall here. It would have been different in ancient times. Part of it's been ransacked and taken away, but it's a very, very cool walk if you ever get a chance to walk along Hadrian's Wall, and big parts of it are still there, as you can see. So that was one of his trips, was to Hadrian's Wall. In a trip to Judea, he settled some veterans who had fought, basically because he knew that Judea had revolted already several times. So the idea was we need some soldiers kind of at the ready here just to keep Judea under control. He also made an unpopular law with the Jews prohibiting circumcision. We know that was a very important holy law for the Jews. So Hadrian kind of antagonized them a little bit, by making that law. And so it's not a big surprise. We have the Third Jewish Revolt from 132 to 135 AD, maybe partially in response to this law that seemed to antagonize and take away a Jewish tradition. This Third Jewish Revolt, one of the fiercest revolts in Roman history, and tons of Roman lives, but also tons of Jewish lives were lost during this revolt. And it seemed to take a bit of a toll on Hadrian. He had a successful reign, but towards the end, he got a bit bogged down and mired in the Third Jewish Revolt. After this revolt, the Romans did win, but again, at a big cost of life. Judea was completely renamed. They wanted to just kind of stamp this out, renamed it City of Palestina, and Jews were forbidden entry into the city of Jerusalem. So kind of remarkable then each time the Romans put down one of these revolts, the consequences get higher, right? Possibly attempting to eradicate Judaism itself by not allowing them to even congregate there. Um, so he ended expansion, but Hadrian also was active militarily. It doesn't mean Rome wasn't defending itself and having battles. So he was active militarily. He was respected by the soldiers and popular with the soldiers. So the military was largely on his side, even though he liked other things and was interested in architecture and art and stuff like that. He was still with the soldiers and active militarily. Towards the end of his reign, he traveled a little bit less. He had been traveling for a long time, over half of his reign. And after the Third Jewish Revolt, again, he slowed down a little bit. That took a bit of a toll on him, and he eventually died in 138 AD. But luckily, by then, he had already picked his successor, Antoninus. And we'll talk more about Antoninus. So Hadrian is certainly one of the more famous emperors, and everyone's heard of Hadrian's Wall in northern England. Now, the last little bit of this chapter will just take us through some cultural bits of living in the Roman Empire at this time, and I'm just going to do one of them today, and I'll finish the rest tomorrow. Get myself out of there. It's a little bit hard to see. And we will deal with the last two of the 5 good emperors in the next chapter, but we will finish up today with Roman theater. Just one of Rome's pastimes. We've already talked about other things, and we'll deal with those more. But we think the empire peaked in population sometime between the reign of Vespasian and Hadrian. It's hard to say exactly, but maybe the peak being between 50 and 70 million people. It seemed like about 20% lived in cities and 80% lived in more rural areas. 20% for living in cities was a very high percentage for the time compared to other civilizations in that time period in the ancient world. Now, theater, you can see a Roman theater up here, and there's various cities that have Roman theaters still remaining. This is where you go to see plays and stuff. It seemed to be very popular. We think of the Romans as just loving gladiatorial fights, but they had a lot of other interests too, and theater seemed to be a very popular pastime of the Romans. For example, if you look at a 4th century calendar from ancient Rome, that was something we still have written down that remains. There was 132 days marked off as theater days, where the theater would be running and people would be able to go and visit and have theater time. So that shows how popular it was. The scaena, which is the word for the stage, had a backdrop, and you can kind of see that here. This would have been where the audience sits on the theater here, and up here would be the stage, and there's kind of a backdrop there, decorated by niches, and these would have little statues all back here filled with gods and heroes and maybe members of the imperial family, so that would be the traditional backdrop for a Roman play. A normal theater might seat around 5,000 people, and men and women could attend, and free and slaves could also attend. They probably wouldn't get the best seats; they'd be sitting further back. But even slaves could attend these theater days. There's supposed to be a little bit of something for everyone. Now, as far as what type of plays they preferred, it seemed like in the East, the tragic plays were a little bit more popular. Greek plays like Oedipus Rex, which we talked about last semester, about the man who marries his mother, kills his father. It's a very tragic thing. Those seem to be popular in the East. The West, over time, they seem to flock more towards comedies with characters in kind of silly, ridiculous situations, get you away from your everyday lives, right? They'd be very different from our comedies nowadays. Basically, they would put characters in situations that were kind of hard to imagine, things that would never actually happen in real life. So, for example, you might have a slave who, pulls a fast one on his master and kind of gets some things over on him. Now, you wouldn't really want your slave to do that, but seeing it on a comedy would be kind of funny. This clever slave who tricks his master and does these things to him and kind of gets some things over on him. So there were some comedic playwrights who became popular. Plautus is a very famous comedic playwright who we have the most plays of any other Roman playwright, Plautus. So theater was popular. Although you wouldn't want your son to grow up and become an actor, it was still considered kind of a disreputable profession. Anything where you performed was not considered reputable. Even though they liked viewing theater, they wouldn't say, man, I'd love for my kids to be in the theater one day. It's just not like nowadays where people think, oh, it'd be cool if my kid was an actor. It was not considered a profession you aspired to in the ancient world. So, yeah, very, very cool. Some of the Roman plays are actually very funny. If we do get back to school, I might show you. There's a famous movie. It might be from, I don't know, the 70s or 80s, but it's called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and it's a mashup of various Roman plays, and they take the themes of all of them, put them into one. But if you ever have a chance to see it, check it out. It's pretty funny. A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. So we will stop there for today, guys. And next time we should be able to finish up the entire chapter. We'll talk about some other Roman pastimes like chariot racing and some last bits of Roman culture before finishing up chapter 10. Thank you guys for doing so well and following along and keeping your notes. And we should be having our test towards the middle part of next week, okay? And I'll see you tomorrow to finish up our week together. Walete.